is Hollisa Alewine, and welcome back to our investigation of Pharisee, friend or foe. It's an interesting study because so much of it is history. And if you're a history buff or a biblical history buff, just that part of the investigation is interesting in itself because there's so many groups at play in the first century or just prior to the first century, or even as the landscape is changing after the destruction of the Second Temple, as what we would know as Pharisees are fading out of history, and fading in is what is known as the rabbinic period, which gives form to the Judaism that we would probably be more familiar with than what is being practiced in the first century as Yeshua interacts with each of these groups in some way. So we've covered the Sadducees, their doctrinal beliefs, had a brief look at the Pharisees, the biblical definition, the Essenes. There's other groups out there, Ebionites, and maybe we can do that in a later program. What was the difference between the Jews and the Galileans? And as it turns out, it's very similar probably to something we're already familiar with, which is you can tell by someone's accent where they're from. And so we tend to stereotype sometimes based on geographical location. And we know that happens. But where I want to distill the investigation at this point, out of all of these groups, it's going to be most important in the ministry of Yeshua is going to be the Pharisees, because they gave formation to this doctrine of resurrection, to the idea that there's good and bad angels, to the idea that there's going to be, a great throne judgment where people are rewarded or punished according to their deeds. The idea of there being a bodily resurrection, not just a soul floating around in space somewhere. So this particular group, really, they're coming on to the world stage at that time. I don't believe it was any accident, because the first century, if this is when Messiah is going to appear on earth and to die, be buried, and be resurrected, then there has to be a preparation, an expectation that those things would happen. And it's through the Pharisees that we get this expectation of a Messiah and the resurrection. So John comes very specifically to prepare the way, but that way really is already being prepared even prior to Yeshua's conception. And we can trace the Pharisees back a couple of centuries. They were known as Hasidim or Chasidim in Hebrew, not to be confused with the Chasidim that you see today. If you think of Chasidim today, you're probably thinking of men in black suits and black hats, the more ultra-Orthodox sects of Judaism. Not the same group of people. But the Chasidim, remember, a Chasid is one who does righteousness. And so these would have been distinct people during the period of the Maccabees who were known for righteousness and would have been part of that historical period, if you've ever read about it. But by the time that Yeshua appears on the scene, you've got two basic houses of the Pharisees. You have the house of Hillel, and you have the house of Shammai. And at the time that Yeshua began his ministry, between these two major houses, think of it, if we put it into a secular context, maybe we've got Republicans and Democrats, although I'm sure that there's no comparison at all. But they had two distinct houses where Pharisees could go to learn, and they would either learn with house, school of Shammai, or the house of Hillel. Now, the school of Shammai was more strict in its interpretations and in its applications of the Torah. the house of Hillel would have been much more merciful. We say letter of the law. In Judaism, they would say the line of the law. So Shammai would have been much more line of the law, and Hillel would have been much more spirit of the law. In fact, if we were to do just a very, make a chart, an analysis chart of the things that Yeshua taught and put them side by side with the basic doctrines and applications and traditions of the house of Hillel, it would be very close in every area except divorce. Yeshua tended to line up with Shammai on the issue of divorce, which is important because as he's teaching that you can't just put your wife away for any cause, that's basically the message of Shammai. You need a really good reason to divorce your spouse. And so with Hillel, by the time Yeshua starts his ministry, the house of Hillel is still very active. But the house of Shammai has control. It has power. And their rulings are tending to rule the day. In other words, these would be the stricter line of the law rulings. What was the difference between the two? Shammai liked to have students who were wealthy, who were already educated, and socially upward. But with Shammai is that he scorned converts. He didn't have a high opinion of Gentiles for a number of reasons. If we looked at the history just prior to this, and let's say you're a Jewish young man walking down the road, and the Romans have literally crucified hundreds of Jews, you can see where Shammai might have a low opinion of Gentiles. But Shammai did scorn any converts, any Gentiles who might come in and want to be joined to the covenant. He's going to be a little younger than Hillel, so more of a contemporary of Yeshua. He would have probably been alive at the time that Yeshua was born. But by the time Yeshua starts ministering, basically we're talking about the disciples of these two major rabbis, Hillel and Shammai. Shammai accepting the wealthier, better educated young men. Hillel, on the other hand, welcomed anybody. He was not a wealthy man himself. It's believed that maybe he was just a woodcutter, and he maintained that profession, and we can understand from some of the writing that his wife didn't even have a housekeeper. She didn't have any help at all. She ran her own kitchen, even though he was at that time the greatest rabbi in Judea. Shammai is going to be known by the measuring rod. You say, what do you mean by that? Shammai was a builder of some description. We don't know exactly what he did, but he was a builder, and he carried a measuring rod, as most builders back then, I'm sure, did. Just the way builders today, they carry measuring tapes on their belts. He would have carried a measuring rod. And with this particular measuring rod, it's come to be a symbol of some things. And it especially symbolizes Shammai, because he didn't just use the measuring rod to measure carpentry things. He used the measuring rod to push people away. And significantly, he pushed away some converts. Most of us have heard the tale about the 3 converts, or maybe you've only heard about one of them. Probably most people have only heard of one. There were 3. We've heard the story of the one who went to Shammai and then went to Hillel and said, teach me the Torah while I stand on one foot, and then I'll convert. And then we know Shammai runs him off with the measuring rod. But there were actually 3 converts, and those 3 converts are significant in not only what they say, but how each responds, how Shammai might respond to that convert or potential convert, and then how Hillel responded to those potential converts. With the house of Shammai, or Shammai himself, remember there is, if they have no portion in the world to come, then why bother with them? They'll never really be one of us. Hillel, on the other hand, believed just the opposite, and he would welcome a convert. It was the house of Shammai that did become associated with the stricter discipline of the Torah, that measuring rod being the symbol. And in the Messianic times, and remember, Christians aren't the first people to come up with the idea of a 1,000-year reign. That's coming out of Judaism. There's an understanding that the house of Hillel, even though it had been subjugated to the house of Shammai during that first century up until the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD. At that point, the tradition says that a bat kol, or a daughter voice, like voice of the Spirit, Holy Spirit, spoke and said that from then on, the rulings of the house of Hillel would prevail and Shammai would be subjugated to the rulings of the house of Hillel. In other words, that which the rod of iron would be subject to the more compassionate approach, the merciful approach of Hillel. And that sounds that's what we would want if we had to pick between the two. Of course, we want the more merciful approach of the house of Hillel. That was Yeshua's approach for the most part. But as we're reading in the book of Revelation, there's an interesting hint in there. And again, it's coming out of the Jewish tradition, or we would never know it. But in the Jewish tradition, it says that in the Messianic era, the house of Shammai will prevail. You say, what does that mean? What are they known for? They're known for the more rigid, stricter discipline as it pertains to keeping the Torah. And so when we get into Revelation and we begin to read phrases about Yeshua ruling with a rod of iron, and with a rod of iron he will rule the peoples, then it's hard not to wonder if these are the same thing. If somehow in that Jewish tradition there was an intersection that John would have not just known about, but been inspired to write about, that there will be a turnaround. We are in an era of grace and mercy now, according, not just according to Yeshua, but within Judaism, again, there's this sense of we're under the house of Hillel, the more merciful approach to the Torah. But in the Messianic kingdom, there won't be any excuses. And so this merciful application is going to be replaced with the rod of iron. And then in Revelation, that's exactly what we read. But it's important to know the difference between those two rabbis and their students, because there was frequently animosity between the two of them. But let's remember, what do we mean when we say animosity? We're talking about Jews. They're all Jews. They just have different approaches in the way that they apply the Torah in a practical way. So what would be the difference? Well, maybe between, I don't know, in terms of Christianity, if you can think of a denomination, it's just that there's slight differences. One's a little more rigid than the other, but they're very close. Maybe this kind of Baptist and that kind of Baptist, or this kind of Methodist and that kind of Methodist. It's hard because it's a different historical period. So we're talking about they're all Jews, but different approaches to application. Now, if we bring this over and we put this in our lifetime, as you have people coming in a new way to identify with the Torah, with the covenant, and to try to apply those rules, to apply those ethics of the Torah, and they don't see them as faded away or going under law. They instead see them as, eternal teaching and instruction, that it's a kindness, not a curse. That's exactly what you'll notice. There is constant confusion and argument over how best to apply those Torah principles. And, that's one of the things that would be said back and forth is you're destroying the Torah. Well, they're not destroying the Torah. They're arguing about what does it actually mean and how do we actually do it. So it's a little bit of a hyperbole. So you're destroying the Torah. It just means I think you're giving the wrong interpretation. And so this is the challenge. It's going to be going back and forth. You're giving the wrong interpretation. You're destroying the Torah. They're not. It's actually, if you think about it, as long as people are arguing about the Torah, at least the Torah is still being held up. What we don't want to be known for is just the argument. But the idea that this is so important that it's worth talking about. We don't want that to occur to excess, where that's all that we're known for is disagreeing and disunity and so forth. Because if so, haven't we just gone back to the same situation they were in the first century, where they would call each other pretty bad names? In fact, the phrase synagogue of Satan comes up a lot. And I've heard some pretty foolish things as it concerns that phrase. We wouldn't be making mistakes and calling all synagogues of Satan if we knew the historical context of that phrase and where it came from. It comes from Judaism itself, but it's Jews talking about Jews. The practices of Shammai and Hillel would have been different. The way that they did their daily prayers, the way they conducted their synagogue services, they would have been slightly different. And if he's from the school of Shammai, he wants to go to a synagogue where they practice the methods of the school of Shammai in terms of the order of service and so forth. So you might have this synagogue or that synagogue. Now, where there is no choice, I'm sure there was overlap. But remember, that divide is growing wider up until the destruction of the second century. In fact, there's going to be all sorts of intrigues. I don't know if we have time to talk about it. If not, you can read it in the book, where there was an alliance formed at some point between the house of Shammai and the Zealots. And what happened was some students from the house of Hillel were assassinated by the Zealots, and we don't know if it was under the direction of Shammai or his students, but we know that some of them were there. They were present when it occurred. So you can see this was pretty serious in terms of the violence. We also know that some of the students from the house of Hillel left when Shammai's house took control, and they went and they stayed with the Essenes. They became Essenes. So again, there's allies, there's intrigues, but over time, there's going to be certain issues of the Torah that come up, and you're going to be identified as Shammai or Hillel, how you think or what that means. By Yeshua's day, and especially as we get closer to the destruction of the Second Temple, the house of Hillel rejects polygamy out of hand. Their opinion is, yes, it occurred in the Torah, but this is not approval of the practice. In fact, Torah gives us reasons not to multiply marriages, that it should be one man and one woman. And so when Rabbi Eliezer from the house of Shammai, it became known that he had married a second wife, that he was practicing polygamy. Because remember, Shammai is going to be the more literalist interpreter of the Torah. They're going to say, because it happened in the Torah, it must be okay for me to have a second wife. The house of Hillel says that was not the intent. Torah often gives you an example and then later tells you don't do that. In other words, don't take your brother's wife. Again, had that happened before? Yes, but not a good example. The only example where you're permitted is in the levirate marriage, which at that point wasn't happening very much either. So Hillel said that from then on, one man, one woman, to the point now to where they say if you're practicing polygamy, then you're of the seed of Satan. Now, that phrase should sound familiar because you heard John the Baptist use it and you heard Yeshua use it. Why were they using that phrase? Because it was a phrase that had come into common use. When you disagreed with the interpretations of the other side, or how someone was applying the Torah in what you felt was a twisted way, you would say they were of the seed of Satan. And so that's what the house of Hillel said about the house of Shammai. It's the seed of Satan. It's the synagogue of Satan. Why? Because they're practicing polygamy. They say, well, they're destroying the Torah. They're giving an improper interpretation. So what do we know about Shammai? He didn't like Gentile converts. And that's important to know about him. Because Yeshua, even though it wasn't clear to his disciples, we can tell in the book of Acts that they're having trouble wrapping their minds around this whole Gentile thing. We got little peeks, like with the centurion, but for the most part, the Jewish believers are pretty astounded that Gentiles are starting to be brought into the faith. And they're having to work through it all over again. They're going back to the scriptures, and these are men who have walked with Yeshua. Or like in the case of James, grew up with Yeshua, and they're still not real sure about what we're supposed to do with Gentiles. And so that question becomes part of the conversation in the book of Revelation, where we see that phrase appear, the synagogue of Satan. Now, it's not that it's referring specifically to people practicing polygamy. That's a catch-all phrase for anybody misapplying the Torah. To the Jewish reader or a listener of the book of Revelation, what would they have identified that with, considering the time period in which John lived, which again, he lived longer than the other disciples, so he's going to live closer there to that destruction of the second temple when that language, seed of Satan, synagogue of Satan, was in wide use. In fact, we know it was in wide use even in the time of Yeshua. What would they have identified in context? Because remember, in context in Revelation, where you're reading about synagogue of Satan, it's talking about not just Jews that are gathered around the throne. It talks about people from every nation, tribe, and tongue. Now, to the house of Shammai, that would have given them a shiver. Every nation, tribe, and tongue? They don't have any part in the world to come. What are you talking about? Who would have accepted that picture as the ideal? The house of Hillel. They welcomed the Gentile convert. And we don't really even know to this day, those 3 converts that are listed, whether they were 3 actual people. Remember what I said about Agadic literature? You're not really sure if you're supposed to take it as being literally true or as an example to apply. And those 3 converts had a reason why he was willing to convert. And Shammai and Hillel, they responded to those 3 converts in 3 very distinct ways. And I actually believe those 3 converts are still out there. Not the 3 literal people, but the 3 attitudes of those 3 potential converts. I think they're still out there because you can very frequently look at religious seekers and see they're doing and saying the same things. Hillel was the one that said, hey, I can see that there's some insincerity here, but Hillel wouldn't run them off. Shammai would take the measuring rod to him and poke him, get out of here. You're not sincere. Hillel would, come on in, and he'd give him a little bit. He'd give them just a little bit, and then they would keep learning, and he'd give a little bit more, and they would keep learning and keep learning and keep learning. Before they knew it, this insincerity, they would spot it as they studied, and they would recognize it for what it was and grow past it, which is what we should all be doing. But in context, the idea of every nation, tribe, and tongue, and talking about those who call themselves Jews, but they're not, I will cause them to bow down at your feet and to admit that I have loved you. Well, that's exactly what the Pharisees said about the Gentile convert, that God loves them because they didn't grow up clinging to the covenant the way that a natural-born Jew did. Coming from the house of Hillel, the inheritance we have is that God loves them so much because they come of their own volition. They have to make this huge sacrificial change to come from the culture and the religion and place that they were and to cross over into the covenant of Israel. And he loves them for that. That's the attitude of the house of Hillel, not the attitude of the synagogue of Satan, the house of Shammai. So Adonai is preaching a Pharisaic doctrine. So that's good news in the book of Revelation.